So I'm Marvin. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford in the remote sensing of ecology and ecohydrology group there. And our goal is to try to understand how, at large scales, we can understand how plants respond to climate change and drought and how that varies within a given species. So I did share these slides. Um, okay. So I'm gonna just quickly show you all a couple slides of what I've been working on and trying to understand how interspecific variation is important to our ability to understand how ecosystems function and maybe get a sense of how different traits that would be important to you all in the context of a garden or thinking about restoration projects, how that would be important and what information I could provide potentially um, with respect to databases and understanding of plant physiology. Can everyone, I hope everyone can see this appropriately.
Yeah, that looks
Um,
great. Yeah.
cool. So I like to start with this image of the Santa Monica Mountains. So this is a plot near Santa Barbara. And even though there's a relatively consistent range of different types of species that are present, they're going to all ultimately respond to climate change and their response to water in general differently based on, say, aspect and different or distance away from a water source, the amount of light that they're getting, sort of local competition that they may experience. Um, And as a plant physiologist, I try to understand the ways that we can measure the water stress and water status of plants, and especially as they dehydrate, and think about the traits that define how effectively these plants dehydrate. So on the right-hand side, you're looking at a bunch of red leaves that have had their chlorophyll removed to illustrate and emphasize the vein structure of the plants. Um, and what we found across a range of plants is that the denser the sort of placement of the vein structures allows for plants to be more resilient in drought. So we can use information about how traits vary across different species and within species to understand how they'll ultimately respond to drought on a larger scale. So, for example, or at least another example of how these traits can vary even within relatively closely related individual or species. So this is two species of Ceanothus, California lilac, um, which are likely to be found in similar locations, but differences in the structure of the leaf surface for these two different species. So on the right-hand side, and the top, you see two cross sections for both of these species. And what's cool about the at least Ceanothus ferracei is that it has these crypts and the ability of the plant to like maintain a humid environment around its stomata helps it deal with the trade-off that plants have where they have to lose water to do photosynthesis. And if you, for instance, in San Francisco, for example, if you planted a plant that maintain the humid environment, it potentially could either do very well or um, like lead to sort of like leaf fungal problems that could um, be actually detrimental in the long term. But aspects of plant physiology and plant structure are particularly exciting to draw relationships with a species climate and ultimately predict how they'll respond to climate change. And I try to utilize variation among, say, trees and break it down into branches and trunks and leaves and develop a way of holistically estimating plant responses and estimating plant water stress, especially actively and in person or sort of like in the moment. Um, the problem, though, is that a lot of the measurements that we take are on a relatively small scale. So on the right hand side, we have a pressure bomb, which we don't usually try to call it that when we're going through TSA, but it's very useful for determining the water status of plants. So we can estimate how stressed out a plant is based on that. But to take a bunch of different measurements of, say, a forest or across the mission district, like by the time you've finished going up and down mission, you've the entire ecosystem that you once measured has changed. And to get a better understanding of how uh, over a day, for instance, a certain pool of plants or a given community changes, you need to look at a larger scale. On the left-hand side, these are overlaid sort of a common size of a pixel from a NASA satellite called SMAP, which is the Soil Moisture Active Passive satellite, and it measures the water content of both the soil and the plants in the area. But given the sort of variety of intra, so within a given species and then inter across different species variability, to try to like represent the variability that one would see or sort of the stress of a given pixel um, to the sort of traits of the different trees or plants that are in a given area is relatively difficult. Um, and I assume also you all understand that even like within a given pixel, say like within the sunset, if you take the yellow versus the green, even within those, you'll see a large scale of variation in how plants are doing. Um, so that's been I've been working on at Stanford and trying to use metrics that we have of water status at larger scales on a smaller scale and try to correspond measurements of water status to both that specific measurement. So in this case, it's called VOD, which is the vegetation optical depth, which is just a thickness of water. And then water potential, which is sort of the driving force of water within um, the plant. And as that value becomes more negative, the plants are more stressed and more likely to build up embolism, so air pockets inside of their veins that stop the flow of water through their vasculature. If you look at just the branches, we're able to show a very strong relationship between the two of them, which is great. And what's also cool is that you're able to see, in addition to that, that the plants are, you can see the response of SM, which is soil moisture, in this relationship, where as the soil begins to dry down even further, the plants are showing drier content on the sort of x-axis here, and then also having lower water content on the y-axis. So using these tools, you can think about how we can, again, think of a holistic way of how plants respond to water stress. Like how does that expand to a larger scale and potentially a pixel that encompasses all of the sunset. Um, and what's cool is I'm not alone. So there's a group of people that are trying to like curate all of the different ways of estimating water status. And there's also sort of both small scale and larger scale measurements of these non-invasive measurements. So in addition to the difficulty of measuring a lot of different elements of an ecosystem, um, the measurements are destructive. So you have to cut off leaves, which could be dangerous or detrimental in the long term for particularly vulnerable species. But there's a variety of different traits, and we have a large sort of understanding of the ecological and sort of microclimate associations between traits and uh, the physiology and water status of the plants.
No.
So,
Oh, I'm
yeah,
just going to pause you there for a second, Marvin.
yeah,
It's wonderful information. I just want to make sure that others who are on the call, is it okay for people to stop you and ask you to elaborate on something or something that they never thought about? Have a little, or would you like
yeah.
to kind of share the slides first and then have a conversation?
Oh no, I'm also, this is the last slide.
Oh,
So
oh,
feel free
okay,
to
okay. No worries.
ask me also. Yeah.
Okay,
Did
great.
anyone have any questions up until this point of like or thoughts? I think my goal is trying to illustrate that there's a great wealth of resources that folks can use to try to have informed plantings or informed in the same way that you wouldn't like there's a benefit to having a tomato variety that's fog resistant or sort of like mildew resistant in San Francisco. Um, there's other aspects of the hydrology of plants that is particularly useful. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions. You have any thoughts?
Yeah, it was really, I mean, just a very simple thing about the vein structure inside a plant, like that really
Hmm.
matters. And then these pockets of water, or air, like that just insulate a plant a little bit more from climate change. I was wondering if you could go into it, the physiology of what helps plants survive. Because we all know like the term succulents and deciduous and
Hmm.
evergreen, but maybe you could kind of think about like what are those things that native plants do maybe that help them survive in a drought situation?
Right. So the vein structure, it's very cool. So again, it's like the redundant pathways for flow. But if you the way that water moves through plants is through a negative gradient of water potential, but it's a increasing amount of stress at the upper part of the canopy relative to the soil. So the plants are sucking water through their veins, and then water is leaving through their stomata, so the little pores on the leaves. Um, and under a certain amount of tension, the plants, well, throughout a day, really, the plants are opening and closing their stomata. So there's a lot of evidence of like midday stomata closure because the your water use efficiency, the amount of water that you're losing for a given amount of carbon that you're gaining is going to decrease at that time during the day. And then at night, you'll refill. Um, but especially in angiosperms, sort of flowering plants, their veins are so large that a lot of water or air can just seed into their vessels. So there's little pores on the cells. Um, and as that happens, you block the amount of flow that you get in the system. So if you're moving, say, like a gram of water every minute, you may lose sort of I don't know, 20% or something, and you're moving only 80% after you've lost a certain amount of veins. But again, if you have, say, like, if you think about like a Quercus, Quercus lobata versus Quercus agrifolia, so the coast live oak versus blue oak, like a blue oak has a much larger leaf, and the veins are a lot more spread out. And there's two things happening there compared to the agrifolia, the coast live. The coast live oak has very small leaves and it tends to be cupped, which does a similar thing to the ceanothus, where it sort of maintains a little bit of a humid air underneath, because all of their stomata are on the bottom. Um, but they're also thicker and denser than the lobata, and having sort of a very strong structure tends to allow you to sort of avoid a lot of the negative impacts of the cavitation of that, like collapse of vessels and seeding of water into the tissues. Um, and then lobata is deciduous. So agrifolia, it's like investing a lot of energy into developing those leaves, and then it keeps those leaves for a very long time, compared to lobata, which tends to lose the leaves. Um, yeah, does that answer the question or anything else you
Yeah,
want to say?
yeah, no, it's so fascinating. Oh, does anyone else have things that came up during Marvin's early slides?
I thought it was really interesting to see the differences in the leaf uh, structure of the different ceanothus, and I
Yeah.
tend to see a lot more of the purple one around kind of the area where I live in Arena, and less of the white one. But to me, it kind of feels like the white one has more adaptation for maybe fog to kind of have those crypts to store moisture. Is there like
Yeah.
is there a difference in like the waxy coating of the leaf or something that helps it? Um,
Yeah. Oh, so you're seeing more of the one that has the crypts than the
no,
oh
the
less
other one,
other
the
one.
purplish. But
Yeah.
that could just
Well,
be
that's
landscape preference, like who's planting what.
that is one aspect of it. I think it's actually the opposite. So I would expect like if the benefit of having the crypts is actually in drier environments where you can maintain
Mm,
a humidity, right? And if you
yeah.
have the sort of flatter leaf that doesn't have as much sort of invaginations of its surface, then it won't store water and like lead to problems like that.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of species that have the stomata on the top because they live on water. They just don't want to have water just pooling on top of the tissue.
Okay. That makes sense.
But often both of those do tend to have like thick cuticles and things like that. Um,
We
nice.
Yeah, we have a comment from Larry who can't use his audio. Unfortunately, we're sorry, Larry. It says, I like all the physiology you're
Hmm.
explaining. Is there enough data over time from the methodologies you mentioned that allow some predictions?
Yeah. So the way I guess I thought it was like how long of a well, where are you thinking? Um, and I guess it all is location suspended dependent. So there are large databases of these traits. Like the Forest Service has a lot of plots where they've had long-term measurements of even just like the trees diameter at breast height, which is a common measurement, and it allows you to get a sense of sort of how much above ground biomass the plant is supplying information or water to and structural components. Um, and then over time, you can measure the growth of the trees. Um, in urban environments, there's definitely been a lot less measurements. Um, but during my PhD, I was able to do a couple measurements in Sacramento where we did a collection of different city trees where we measured the thickness of the leaves, the area, all of these different measurements, the amount of solutes the trees have in them. Um, and that could be used to sort of estimate how much we can change the demographics of a populate of a city's sort of urban trees. So like if we have more palms or more larger angiosperms, or we've switched to all pines for some reason, how will the overall city be able to sequester more carbon or not, depending on the sort of water use efficiency of different trees?
I'm curious about the phenology of this data in like San Francisco specifically, because
Hmm.
especially compared to like Sacramento or even moving further east, it's just like phenologically a completely different landscape. So I'm curious what that looks like, and also like in San Francisco, how far back this data set that you're working in has extended, and also like what the future prospects of collecting data in San Francisco look like.
Hmm. So there's data, I think the SMAP satellite's been up, I think, since the late 2000s. So there's two overflights. So there's one at 6 a.m. and one at 6 p.m. for every pixel during that time, every 3 or so days. Um, the phenological aspect and how much it varies. So like what's unfortunate but also very cool about plants is that even like within a given tree, there's so much variation, right? So a leaf that's developed in the sun at the top of a canopy is going to be thicker and uh, denser than a leaf that's inside of a canopy. So I think you can take the elements of that aspect and extrapolate it to this case where you're more likely to find trees and traits that are more adapted to drier environments, um, and potentially the further east you go, then closer to sort of like the ocean. Um, is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
I think
super
by
interesting.
by phenology, did you mean sort of like the timing of when trees are like leafing out or flowering, or
Yeah, I
um,
think I was thinking more about like the difference in phenological data in San Francisco specifically because of how bizarre our seasons are, and just like
mhm,
what that research looks like and how that provides challenges to extrapolating and also predicting for San Francisco.
yeah. I think the San Francisco especially is difficult because there isn't much data. Um, and also with city trees, they get trimmed. So any current growth, um, like if you wanted to associate the current growth patterns with and relate it to like previous growth, it's difficult because the leaves aren't there anymore and you can't estimate how they've been developing in the current environment. Um, yeah,
That is super interesting to me. Thank you for sharing.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm kind of imagining all these pixel layers that they can just compare over what, 10 years or into the next 20 years or something to see how this slice of ecosystem is holding up and how it's changing. Maybe even
yeah.
new. Can they tell at that level like which plants are coming in, or is it's just about water in the soil and the plants? It's not really about plant makeup. That's what the on the ground scientists are doing,
Right,
right?
yeah. So they've been in two separate camps for the past however long, where you have remote sensing people who are looking at pixel size information, and people on the ground who are just measuring what they need to measure to try to understand what's going on. Um, but because of that same like scale mismatch is what is really called, like you can't directly associate a given tree to the measurements of water that you're seeing. But, and even so, the site that I've been working at is at the University of Missouri MoFlux. It's part of like the Ameriflux system. So across the US, there's a lot of towers that measure they like to call it the breathing of the planet. So there's measurements of how much oxygen is leaving, and then how much carbon is being sequestered by the trees, and how that changes throughout the day as the plants start transpiring. At this particular site, where we set up this radiometer, so the measurement of water content, we found that it's really very sensitive to the upper branches of trees. So if you could think of the entire canopy as a single like flat layer of leaves and then branches and then trunks, um, at least at this particular wavelength, is very sensitive to just the upper branches. But it could also be sensitive to trunks and trees that are more voluminous, um, because you just have a larger representation of the sort of change in water content relative to the soil moisture change over time.
Yeah, this talk is making me realize how we depend on plants every day for our health and well-being, but how little we really understand them. Like sometimes we
Mhm.
can tell the plant is dry or it needs some extra fertilizer or something like that. But to have this like, yeah, that gives me a lot of faith that that there are
Mhm.
people out there studying like how and how much oxygen is released into our environment and how the plants are doing under stress or with maybe with more water like flooding and things that are happening because we know that we're like living beings are adaptable and ready to change, but how much? What's their limits?
All right. When you all decide what plants, or I guess location is probably dependent on availability, but when you look at what plants to plant in a new location, when you set up a new garden, what goes into the consideration?
Rachel, do you want to take that one? Should I take that one?
Sure, I can.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a new addition to the gardening team. I think a lot of times we are pushing for drought tolerant local natives, which works because clients are interested in preserving water. However, there's definitely a decent amount that is based on like clients' aesthetic preferences of what kind of inflorescences they want to look at, like what they want the color scheme of their yard to look like. Um, so I would say it's our side of it is saying like here are the plants that are local natives we would recommend. But most of our clients are on irrigation systems. We only have, I think, one client who is not using consistent irrigation. Um,
Right. I think that's another problem with like thinking about urban trees is that they're irrigated as well. So then you can't necessarily extrapolate how they would respond to drought um, to say like a natural stand of that particular species. A lot of there's an idea of like drought priming when you're trying to study how plants respond to droughts. You make them experience drought first because that initial response is going to be a lot more sharp and distinct, and you'll overestimate how much of an actual response you're seeing. Um, but in that case, it's interesting that like the the state of irrigation it can really change what you decide can go in a certain place.
yeah, I think there is also always the like especially with planting kind of shrubby native perennials, is having to tell clients like pushing that line of aesthetic of being like, well, this is a native plant and it does die back during this time, and you have to trust that it will come back. And generally, just like people's desire for constant bloom and aesthetics versus drought tolerant natives, which I think leads people into more consistent irrigation practices, versus going with the like native plant flow of drying out and then blooming.
Mhm.
Laura, I saw you pop in. You have a question?
Yes. I have so many questions. This is so interesting. Maybe I'll just throw two out and then turn my camera off. Kind of riffing on what Rachel was saying, because Nature in the City also does restoration sites, right? And so we're it's interesting to see how the kind of the establishment period and the survival of the plants, how we make decisions about irrigation and whether we can count on the fog in the summer to get the plants established. So that whole aspect is interesting. But I was thinking on a larger scale, what would you say your research, Marvin, that the sort of remote sensing versus this on the ground would be able to help with the sort of assisted migration? In other words, if we are expecting this whole sort of biome shift with the changing climate, like how would you be able to predict maybe what plants will survive better in this new novel environment that's going to be created in the future? Could you use your data to sort of say like, well, in this particular area of, the East Bay might be more similar to what's down in Southern California in 30 years, and we should start migrating some of these plants up there. That was
Yeah.
not a very coherent question, but I think you know what
No,
I'm saying.
I think I do. I think I would one look at soil maps because so much of how the plants are interacting with the water that is available to them is how I showed that little triangle of the soil characteristics. But like if a particular region, despite having similar plants across a range of a large spatial range, like how a more clay-rich soil is going to hold onto water a lot stronger than something that's a little bit sandier. Um, so look to those places first, right? And then beyond that, being able to monitor sections of the city or a particular location that needs to be or is a candidate for restoration. I think being able to estimate how stressed they are. So if we can think about how much the plants are sort of breathing, right? How much they're moving water. If we measure how much water stress they're under and we know how much they are emitting, so a lot of estimates of evapotranspiration could be used. Um, so if the amount of evapotranspiration is superseding their access to water, they'll be under more stress and would benefit from being moved to a location that's better adapted to their environment. Um, the Are you thinking of like moving plants from Southern California up, or more of just sort of estimating how likely it is or how necessary it may be to um,
Yeah, it's kind of right now just sort of hypothetical that instead of the focus on really locally adapted plants where you're trying to grow them, collect seeds from within the watershed where they're presumably the most adapted now, starting to sort of move species that are adapted to a hotter, drier climate into more areas that are predicted to be hotter and drier in the future.
yeah. So I think some people also, I mean, any species has a range, right? So you could, if you're thinking about improving the likelihood of a given species surviving in a different location, think about where the edges of the range is currently. Um, and individuals that have developed and sort of reproduced in that area are more likely to have a genotype that is better associated with dealing with that type of environment, which may be a benefit to a restoration project. Um, so if you have a, we can go back with Ceanothus, but if you have a Ceanothus that is for some reason growing very close to Joshua Tree, um, it is potentially more drought tolerant or has a variety of traits. Um, like the epigenetics of plants is cool, and that like if you, but you have a baseline, right? So if you are within a certain pool of individuals, you have a certain set of traits that develop within that pool that benefits all of those individuals. And you can see it if you look at the traits between, like, I have friends who worked on oaks, especially, and different species of oaks across California, um, and the vulnerability to drought among those oaks sort of followed in line with their native climate. Um, Cities are cool because they're sort of common gardens, so all of the trees are grown among with irrigation and consistent hydration, but seeing the sort of genetic variation leading to actual responses is very exciting.
I had a question since there's data over time. Have you seen, or would there be, like after a fire event or something, does the data show that the plants that kind of come in and recolonize have a different kind of makeup or have different properties than kind of the original plants that were there?
I think in the successional sort of avenue, unfortunately, it seems like it's like the certain traits are beneficial in those environments. So having like the reason why grasses tend to come in first is because they're able to grow faster because of their photosynthetic efficiency. Um, and then being able to disperse very effectively within those environments. So that's why you see a lot of like the chaparral transforming into grasslands, right? Um, the Sorry, can you remind me of the beginning of the question?
Um, just kind of is the plants that are coming in succession, I imagine would be similar species, but are they, can you tell kind of adaptation that's kind of happening as a result of kind of that event, and then recovering from that event?
Um, that's not my specific forte, but I think the thinking about what type of species are able to disperse better. So if you have larger seeds, and are able to allocate a lot more sugars to seeds, you are able to sort of reproduce in a very caustic environment more efficiently. Um, Not necessarily bigger leaves, but I think the response to fire, at least when it's at a regular scale, is that the individuals that are adapted to that environment, reseeders versus sort of resprouting individuals, like they'll maintain the same regime and potentially the same speed. I think resprouters tend to grow faster, at least in that case. So like a manzanita. But the problem is the competition with the sort of invasives and the native grasses that are growing faster.
And I'm kind of reminding with this topic is making me think about how roots are holding the most amount of water because they're closest to that soil water, and then the trunk, and then the branches and the leaves. So, as things pop back, that's probably why plants, you can cut them. Sometimes they can get fire burned or cut off, and then they can just sprout back again. Are there other ways that plants um, make it through extreme events or drought that help them survive? Like they use certain plants, or they cut off their own, branch or something to help others grow, or parts of the plant dies and others continue.
Yeah. I think what I think about, at least in that case, is also your capacity to store sugars as starch. So the more storage of starch you have, the better you're able to allocate that to growth because you need the sugars to grow. Um, and then, um, yeah, there's sort of deciduousness associated with drought. So if you leaves are expensive because they're the largest source of like your water loss and a dehydration experience. So if you are able, you make relatively inexpensive leaves and are willing to drop those leaves, then you're likely to survive a drought experience. There's also photosynthetic stems, which are really cool. So like if you have a capacity like what is that tree? There's a lot of them. I think Cecropia is that it's not native to California or North America, but um, it's a popular city tree that has lots of spikes, but the bark is green. So if you're able to photosynthesize while not having leaves, um, you're able to sort of obfuscate the problem of being stressed out hydraulically.
And Larry's asking about aspen's bark. Is that one example? Something like that.
Aspen's bark. Yeah, As aspen's bark isn't it's usually white, right?
Or maybe because it's white, it reflects
Reflects light.
instead
Um,
of absorbs it, or I'm not sure. Maybe Larry, keep
I think
typing,
that would look more
type
of a
away. Oh,
oh,
he said he thinks it photosynthesizes.
okay.
Mhm.
I haven't thought about aspens photosynthesizing from their barks, but that's another sort of adaptation that would be useful in a situation where you're dehydrated. I think aspens are also able, I mean, relatively thin to the, like they have deep roots. Um, the deeper the root system, um, is also beneficial, but also having a community of plants around you sort of is a term of like hydraulic redistribution. So some plants are helping redistribute water from the lower sort of layers of soil to the upper layers of soil, which can be a sort of indirect effect of for indirect benefit for plants that are nearby a tree that has really deep roots.
So I had a question that came up today. I was talking with volunteers about watering native plants, right? And some people say don't water native plants because we're usually in the stewardship habitat restoration element. So this person was saying, I water my plant 5 gallons a week because I want its roots to go really deep down and grow a very strong native plant in order for it to really live and last longer.
Uh,
Um, but some people say, they're native plants, like let them suffer. You don't water them very much, like try to establish some resiliency. Like, is that like kind of wondering if you have any thoughts about that for people? Like, I
I
know
would
that you're,
say,
yeah,
huh?
go
I
ahead, go
think
ahead.
water them as, I mean, I wouldn't say like 5 gallons seems like a lot. The benefit of planting native plants is to allow them to thrive in an environment. I think you want to get them established as much as possible, right? And depending on like how deep is their soil going really, and how much can the plant access that are important questions to ask and think about. The Yeah, I think water them, but don't like keep them going through, especially the dry periods like the summer and things like that. But I don't think overdo it. And there was a question about my background. I grew up in DC, but my family's from Trinidad and Tobago. It's an island near Venezuela. And I did my undergrad at Occidental College in Los Angeles, and that's where I got into plant physiology when I went to did hydraulics on bromeliads. So bromeliads are this epiphyte related to pineapples, but they live in the trees and they're drought tolerant in a very tropical place. I feel like they sell them at Trader Joe's now, but um, what's cool is there's different species that are adapted to a variety of ranges within the canopy, and that results in them having um, either more plastic responses to increases in sun radiation or dehydration. And instead of like sort of absorbative roots, because they're really just holding on, they have these absorbative hairs, kind of like sequoias, that allow them to absorb water into their leaves instead of through the roots themselves. And then I did my PhD at UCLA thinking about intracirculation in drought tolerance traits, um, and using the relationship between the amount, sort of that sort of speed of increases in drought stress with the amount of water content that's in the tissues to establish thresholds of drought tolerance. So there's a bunch of different ideas about the sort of solute concentration within inside the cells, um, and the point at which the vacuoles and the cells within a leaf collapse and they lose turgor. So if you haven't watered your plant in a long time, or you cut off a leaf or something, um, that particular trait is very useful globally, which is very cool to estimate how drought tolerant certain species are. So like Ceanothus, I think, at least Spinosus, has a turgor loss point that's like in the -2 megapascals. And megapascal, it's like 1 bar is like the amount of energy or sort of pressure that the atmosphere is pushing on us. Um, and a megapascal is 10 times a bar. So there's so much negative pressure within inside of plants that like they're very um, strong at pulling negative tension, and have like a high concentration of solutes within themselves. And the capacity of them to adjust how many solutes based on how much they're photosynthesizing allows them to adapt to changes in the amount of water that's available to them and the sort of drying of the air around them. And then now, so that I use that relationship to estimate to use non-invasive measurements of water content and allow us to estimate the water stress that way using those tools and a variety of different like physical relationships between them. And I've gone up a scale, so using remote sensing to estimate those same water stress measurements. Future plans. It would be lovely to work at a small liberal arts college. I enjoyed that environment as an undergraduate, and I think I could give back to that community through introducing folks to plant physiology. I think it would also be fun to be involved in projects where I can provide knowledge that folks aren't necessarily introduced to on a regular basis. So thinking about different physiological traits that might be useful in determining how we can better fix environments and ecosystems and restore certain ecosystems. Yeah.
And when we talked before this call, you had mentioned things we could do because it all starts in the soil, things that we might do at an ecosystem scale or even at a small backyard garden scale to help our plants be more resilient to climate changes. And
Yeah.
we talk about that a little.
A lot of them are intuitive, so thinking like mulching. But the maintaining a higher amount of like organic components of the soil, avoiding clay and probably ameliorating sand to make it hold and retain water is beneficial. The way that we like, despite clay seeming like it's holding a lot of water, a lot of the same traits that are beneficial to dehydration are also, and a lot of the sort of responses that plants have to uh, drought are the same as to flooding. So if you flood, you're going to have a lot of the same problems, and you want to make sure that you balance the sort of clay to silt and loam in that way. Um, yeah, a lot of the aspects of soil texture are particularly important. Friends of mine are thinking about how plants have access to rock moisture, which is an interesting concept. So if you've ever looked at like a cliff face and you've seen roots growing through rock, the plants are sort of exuding acids and things that can break down the rock, but a lot of water also seeps into those crevices and the plants can access water in that way. So if you have a lot of rocky sand or sort of this is more of an ecosystem scale problem or amelioration, but thinking about how you can better um, adjust watering or planting plants that are able to develop roots that are able to like break into rock over a long period of time and have access to that pool of water. Um, she found that the like a large amount of like ecosystem evapotranspiration can come from rock moisture, especially when the soil moisture is depleted significantly. Um, I guess a lot of the rocks here are a lot more like granites and things. But I'm not sure how, do you all have a sense of how much the soil, what the soil um, construction is in the Bay Area, or at least northern Bay Area on the
Um,
peninsula?
well, the site that we spend the most resources on is sand, just pure sand. And
Hmm.
it's in the Golden Gate Heights neighborhood that this picture behind me is from that area. And it also has chert, so it has some rocky parts to it, but it's really ocean ocean sand. But it makes me think a lot about, the plants that we're planting are adapted to sand and they're adapted to fog, but we also might consider adding more organic materials into the sand, even though we come from this kind of purist background of like restore habitat in a certain way, don't mess it
Hmm.
up, but I think that there's like we live in the Anthropocene. So what does that mean for
Yeah,
us as we think about stewardship and participation in our
yeah.
ecosystems?
I think the ecosystem would have had a lot of organic matter from just like plants losing leaves over time, right? So if you, I don't know what the best practice is necessarily of trying to like reintroduce organic matter other than just like composting. Um, but you could try to sort of make a compost that is based on mostly native trees and maybe try to replicate the organic composition of those particular species maybe in that environment. Um, Probably encourage as much native insects and small scale fauna to try to come back as much as possible because even sort of just like manures and things like that can add organic matter. Um, I I think anything that can be done for the sake of improving the establishment of natives should be done. Um,
Mhm.
I think and it'll also thinking about like watering and reestablishment of those species and individuals in the environment. Like if you're likely to need less water to get them established if you help the soil along. And nutrients have probably been sapped from the soil and sort of lots of runoff and things like that that wouldn't have necessarily happened without human intervention.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think about that because we have lost so much from our natural ecosystems that if we can and have the resources to put them back, we could, and we could do it in responsible ways, not just like going and getting a bag of compost and putting it on the sand, but actually
Hmm.
thinking about all the site materials that are already there, and like working the leaves into the soil, encouraging more wildlife to use the sites as much as we can. That's the goal, end goal. But
Yeah.
awesome.
I know we're almost out of time, but I have one more question.
Sure.
Um, I was wondering how much of your postdoc work is kind of connected to people's access to this information and outreach around it. And then also, if you have any recommendations for groups or organizations that are kind of like paring this down to be able to provide this information to, say, our garden clients or people that don't have an hour to
So,
ask
yeah.
you questions about it.
Um, the I haven't actually like I really should develop a better way of bringing better access to especially this type of data because well you can download soil moisture products from the NASA website if you wanted to sort of see how soil moisture in San Francisco or nearby area has changed over time. Um, the Also those databases that I mentioned, I can also share. So there's one especially that's could potentially be useful. It's called the Xylem Functional Trait Database, um, which is available and is based on a repository of one particular trait, which is the water potential, so that water stress measurement at 50% loss in conductance. So same with the sort of loss in turgor, that measurement is also a good way of gauging how plants are associated with certain types of ecosystems. So a plant that is able to maintain movement of water for a longer period of time is able to has a much more negative value. Um, and the less sensitive the plant is to a dehydration, they're more likely to thrive in an environment that is drier. So if you think about it in the case of like trying to plant certain types of plants and environments, you could use that as a way of justifying certain plants being placed in certain places. Um, the unfortunately, the someone should do it. I could do it. But the way that you estimate this water content is there's bound to be some tech startup somewhere that could also probably has some measurement of this, but they would probably sell it to us, unfortunately. But like if you estimate the all of the data is on NASA's website, you just have to turn it into the actual product, which is why the soil moisture is cool. But then um, the VOD, the vegetation optical depth, people are building. So a useful tool from the that measurement is the live fuel moisture content. So it is useful in estimating how likely the plants are to like how much fuel there is to instigate a fire. So if you were trying to prove that a certain area is more prone to fire because of certain types of species that are in that area, you could use that as a like a detraction from whatever your client may be trying to plant in a certain area. Um, which I can share all of these things with a better description that's less jumbled.
Super cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marvin. I know that hour really flew by. Like
Yeah.
that's impossible. But
I have time.
thank you so much. Yeah. Does anyone have any last questions they want to ask? We don't want to, we want to respect your time.
I have time.
Okay.
I guess, Rachel, what were your thoughts on what would your clients use or benefit from knowing?
I think there's a range. So we certainly have clients who are really enthusiastic and want to know all about the like logistics of what's happening in their garden and how that is helping in climate change adaptation. And then we also have clients that are more so like we want our garden to look nice. But I think that there are a decent amount of clients who would be very interested in having access to like understanding how the native plants that they choose to plant in their garden are working towards drought tolerance and adaptation, and what the specific traits of those plants are. I mean, to me, that's very interesting. I think to other people, that's very interesting and also like builds their relationship to the plants that they're looking at every single day. Um, so yeah, I think this information is super exciting to me. And then I'm kind of prone to thinking about how people can access and process that information without getting lost in the like scientific jargon of it.
Mm-hmm. I can think of options and get back to you.
Yeah, I think soil also, and then sometimes people ask us, like we use a lot of micro bark, and people ask questions about our mulching choices, and what soil is growing in their yard. So I feel like having like soil retention information as well as choices around mulching and water retention. Like having your data that backs that would be interesting.
Yeah. And Marvin, thank you so much. Well, I think what we'd love to do is put this any links you share in the notes for the YouTube when we post it. And